I really do find this interesting, and call me a quality nerd, I don't care. But the fact that you've got your medical device file in your documentation requirements and not specifically referenced in section 7, I think gives you an idea of what the standard is trying to tell you here. It's saying the purpose of your organization is pretty much just this medical device file, isn't it?
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Quality Coffee Break. In this episode, Amy and I are going to be talking about Clause 4 of ISO 13485 and how it really sets the stage for your whole quality management system.
Yes, often underrated. Having a deep understanding of Clause 4, we really believe that it was fundamental to your understanding and comprehension of how a 1345 quality system works.
Agreed. I think Clause 4 really is the foundation upon which all of those other clauses are built.
Absolutely. Right. So let's take a little bit deep dive. So I feel like reading one of them out just to really emphasize the point of, this is how it fits. So if we firstly go to 412, so we're starting to identify those processes that you need in your organization. So the organization shall determine the processes needed for the QMS and the application of these processes throughout the organization, taking into account the roles undertaken by the organization. Well, automatically you have to think about what role you have when you're applying 1345. So as a reminder, roles being a manufacturer, distributor, designer, because that is automatically highlighting for you what clauses of the standard will apply.
Yes, perfect. And it sets the stage for you to be able to make really specific choices in your organization based on your role. You don't have to do everything. It's giving you that permission right at the start, saying pick the parts that are applicable to the job that you're doing.
Absolutely, because if you don't, if you haven't got a sterile medical device, then, why do you need to bother with the sections? I'm not going to remember them, but the sections with regards to sterile, validation of sterile barrier systems and sterilization. It's purely just not applicable, is it?
Right, right. And then I also like how in, I think it's later in that clause, this is, I think, a really good indication or a start where they start talking about the risk-based approach, which ties right into our last episode of how you involve risk-based thinking or include risk-based thinking in your quality management system. Well, here we are in section 4 of the standard that basically says you're going to apply a risk-based approach for all your processes, for all the things. Apply a risk-based approach.
Yes, absolutely. So if you want a little bit of a reminder, maybe we can be clever and put a little link somewhere in the video. I'll give it a go. We'll see. If
Yeah.
if all that fails, I'll just put it in the description. So
Right.
I'll put a little link in the description for the risk-based approach video, because I think you should check that out. As you'll know, so the last part of 412 is saying about determine the sequence and interaction of the processes. That's where you get that diagram, isn't it? We usually find in your quality management, your quality manual, where you're saying, okay, well, this process flows into the other process and the other process and the other process. You have usually it's quite a nice little circular diagram. Right, 413. Now, I feel like this goes into a little bit of deeper. So when I am sort of talking to people about writing documentation and things, I always say about orientation of the reader. And that, for me, is exactly what section 4 is doing. So for that first one, we've got for each QMS, the organisation shall determine the criteria and methods needed to ensure that both the operation and control of these processes are effective. Now, Suzy, what section of the standard do you reckon it's referring to there?
Well, geez, not to put me on the spot, but to me is clause 7, right? This is a
Hmm.
product realization where you're talking about um, how you need to make sure that your process for manufacture or for the process for design transfer or the process for distribution, all of those processes you are required to ensure that they're effective, and you do that by assigning criteria to acceptability. What are your acceptability criteria for all these stages? Not just when you're talking about verification and validation of the processes and the equipment and things like that, but your whole process. You're going to have acceptability criteria all along the way. And it's critical that you understand what those criteria are and you assign those criteria and define the methods from the start for all the phases.
Absolutely. And that's where like section 7 and section 8 really like talk to each other, isn't it? And I feel this is really what this is just trying to get at. So you're looking at your methods needed to, to monitor your processes. And section 8 is going to tell you whether they're going to be performing, where they should be, or they, need further improvement. So yeah, just to have a think about when, you're reading through the standard, what is it actually trying to get at? So, I mean, the next one down is all talking about resources. So you've got to ensure the availability of resources and information necessary to support the operation and monitoring of these processes. So again, that's section 6, isn't it? So we're talking about resource management, and we're also talking about section 8, so monitoring. So you can see why section 8 is so important.
Yeah. Yep. And just as a reminder for everyone, resources are not limited to human resources. You're talking about people, but you're also talking about materials and services and equipment and infrastructure. That these are all important aspects, important resources to ensure that the work that you're doing is effective, that you can do the work effectively.
Yes, very, very important point. I think a lot of people just forget that, resources is more than humans. It is talking about your infrastructure. So that's a really good point. Really, really good point. In addition, so you've got so the next one down, you've got implement actions necessary to achieve plan results and maintain the effectiveness of these processes. So it sounds like there's a bit of a planning activity here and a bit of a monitoring activity. So for me, this is really talking about the role that your top management play in ensuring those availability and the effectiveness of these processes, right? So this is where management review comes in. So that's going to be sort of a massive part of making sure that, you are monitoring that, how effective your quality management system is, and also, implementing more resources where you need to.
Yeah, and I think this is what the beauty of clause 4 too is
Mm.
how you can apply it to all of these other elements. So you just brought up the example of holding top management accountable for this,
Mm.
but even at a smaller level, it applies in clause 7. It applies in clause 8, right? It's still this idea of planning what you're doing and ensuring that you're effective and achieving those planned objectives, right? So at a big scale, those are corporate objectives or quality objectives, right? But even on a small scale for a project of either a product development or even a design change, like at all the levels, you're still talking about needing actions for planned results. So it talks about planning and verifying effectiveness.
Yes, absolutely. And then monitoring the effectiveness, well, that's D, isn't it? So we're talking about monitor and measure as appropriate and analyze these processes. Again, section 8 is coming in. 'Cause, yeah, you can just see how this clause is really trying to get you to think about how all of the clauses, all of the sections of 1345 work together, which is why it's just so fundamental for your understanding to understand and appreciate the relevance of clause 4, even though sometimes as an auditor, it's quite sometimes it can be quite difficult to audit against it because it is just a little bit of repetition. However, it is allowing you just to join up those processes.
Right, right. It is the framework. It is the foundation, as I mentioned earlier. Like these are the base expectations and they get applied throughout. And then, of course, E, right? Item E in that one is about maintaining records. And so this is obviously a key core tenet of the medical device manufacturing business, right? If it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. So you need to establish and maintain records throughout, right? For everything that you're doing. So you need to have records that show how you're compliant with 13485. But what I also love about this item, this bullet point, is that it also refers to any other applicable regulatory requirement.
Mm.
So that could be a local regulation, it can be a geography that you're operating in. So you could be talking about Health Canada requirements, you could be talking about US FDA requirements, you could be talking about the European Union requirements, whatever. So the standard does not limit you, and in fact says you need to be compliant to all of these other local regulations. And furthermore, you need to have records to demonstrate conformance to those regulations.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Applicable regulations, which is why it's so important to have your regulatory strategy, right? Because that's going to identify what regulations are applicable to your organization, and therefore what needs to be implemented within your QMS. Yeah, it's a really good point. So throughout the standard, that's referenced quite a few times. I don't know how many, but it's quite a few times, like, throughout. So it's always a really nice reminder just to have a look back at your regulatory strategy report, to identify what else you might need to be thinking about, should you be writing a procedure.
Yeah, and I know I mentioned the different geographies, but it also goes to that point of, say, environmental regulations that you might be required to follow
Yes.
or comply with, or your electrical waste
Mm,
regulations and your forever chemicals and all of those kinds of things. They're
mm,
all required regulations that are going to be specific to your device and your product and whatever you're doing and where you're doing it. But 1345 says don't forget about them.
mm. I love that. The top tip.
You love a top tip,
I
Amy.
mean, who doesn't love a top tip? I think that is a very good top tip. Is just thinking about the wider picture. Not and what is obvious. Like FDA regulations, or the EU, regulatory specifically like 2017/746 or 745. But it's actually getting you to think about other regulations which might not necessarily be very obvious to begin with. So I think it is a top tip, Susie. I think you're full of them.
Okay. Well, I'm full of something.
Full of top tips. Right. Okay. So yeah. So that I feel like that was a really good start. So then we go into 414. And it's all about changes. So I won't read the full extent, but we all know and love it, don't we? So you got to look at the impact on the quality system. You've got to have a look at the product, and the risk, and things like that. So whenever you are making a change to your quality system, so it might be for example, you might be going for an additional scope, might be changing scope slightly. So what impact does that have on the products that you're manufacturing? So, I mean, the worst case scenario is that you change the scope and actually those products that you're currently manufacturing fall out of scope. So, which obviously would be less than ideal. So it's always, when you've got your change management processes, change control, that you are building in these requirements as set out by 414.
Yes, absolutely. So it's telling you too to consider changes in multiple for against multiple criteria, right? You need to look at your change for its impact on the QMS. You need to look at your change for its impact on the medical device that you're producing under that QMS. And then, of course, my favorite and your favorite is that they're controlled. We like
Hmm.
our changes to be controlled. Um, I think personally that the change management system, this might be a hot take, and this might be
Ooh.
controversial opinion.
Ooh, tell me.
I think the change management system is the most important system for an organization's success as they grow and scale and try and take over the world.
I don't think that's a I don't think there's any contentious statement that you made. This I fully agree. Because if you're not handling your changes with the rigor that they require, everything's just going to fall to pieces.
Falls to pieces, and we've seen it happen. I think probably many of us have seen it happen in various places where we've worked, where and it just takes one event, and then usually it means that the change management system kind of gets an overhaul because
Yeah.
it's like, oh well, that didn't work out. We missed somehow we missed identifying that we tried to make 5 changes on the same day, and oops, that maybe wasn't the best for our operators or something like that, where instantly it becomes obvious and then hopefully appropriate changes are made so that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of my perceptions that I have, I think change management is usually done really well when it comes down to device changes. However, sometimes I've noticed that when it comes down to quality management system changes, that sometimes it's not as well defined. It's not as well documented as something with like a product, a product design change. Because well, I mean, I actually don't know the reason why, but I mean, I think that it's really obvious because, in section 7, whatever it is, you got control of design development changes, haven't you? And it spells everything out. But sometimes I think when things are hidden in section 4, that perhaps people don't give it the attention that actually deserves. So when
Yeah,
you're, mm,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I believe, yeah, I think I've seen a lot of people um, think that the changes are simple. And so they maybe do them more in isolation, or they work through some of these changes with a small group, like a small team, maybe 2 people, and they're sitting around a table saying, "Yeah, I think this is a good thing to do, and these are the tasks that are required." But by not including a broader scope of people who are in the organization, they're missing the impacts on other parts of the organization, and I think that is a huge source of failure. And
mm,
it's so common. I think it's so common
mm,
that people are just and not for anybody's, like, malicious intent, I'm sure. Like, I think it's just you don't know what you don't know, and so you're just going along thinking, "Oh, I can swap this to that, and it's gonna be fine." And then you have kappas down the line because you're like, "Oh, well, this was changed and we weren't notified, so we didn't make all of these other cascading changes that we should have made." And
mm.
it all can be well, not that you're gonna avoid all kappas if you have a good change management program, but, you know, a little bit of foresight goes a long way, and I think that happens in change management planning activities.
Mhm. I think that that would be a really good thing to talk about in another episode. I think good change management is sometimes quite a hard process to get right because
Yeah.
you want to make sure that it's simple enough that it covers all the bases. But yeah, we're going to park that. 'Cause I feel also we could definitely go down like a rabbit warren with change management. But yeah, I reckon we should make a future episode on that. So like hang tight for that. Right. So yeah, moving on from change management, we know that's a really good topic. So you got 415, which is talking about outsourcing processes. So the main thing is that if you outsource a process, it's not obviously your get out of jail free card. It is still your responsibility to monitor these processes, measure these processes, and make sure that they are effective for whatever the process is has been outsourced. And for me, this is definitely where, supplier auditing comes in,
Mhm.
supplier management. So this is really getting you to think about, purchasing, supplier management in section 7.
Yes, and I also think that it's really important when we talk about, incoming goods controls, like, let's not forget that we have the I mean, which is part of the
Mhm.
purchasing
Oh yeah.
process. So
Hmm.
you have your supplier quality, we wanna do really good supplier management, but we also have the opportunity to perform incoming goods testing. or
Mm,
qualification for those critical materials
mm,
so that we are not necessarily relying on the controls of this other organization because we, as the legal manufacturer, retain responsibility of conformity. So,
mhm,
yes, certificates of analysis, certificates of conformance that you get, those are great. But sometimes you end up working with a supplier who doesn't have that level of control. Sometimes you're talking about cutting edge stuff and you're working with academic labs and things like that. At which point you really need to take the responsibility for ensuring conformity. And
mm,
again, this is another section that talks about controls being proportionate to the risk involved, right? So, if you're talking about a critical raw material, your controls are going to be higher or different than when you're talking about maybe a simple labware provider or, you know, waste material or things like that. Like this stuff that doesn't necessarily have a big impact on what your device does or how it works or things like that.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, just having a really good think about how purchasing can your purchasing controls can really help you meet 415.
And then
Um,
the other really important thing, I'm sorry, Amy, the other
no,
really important thing I think about this section 415 is that this is where we talk about written quality agreements with those.
mhm,
And that is a really critical step, especially for your um critical activities. If you have a contracted manufacturer or a contract research organization or a like clinical investigation, like all of those kinds of high value, high importance activities, you really need to have good quality agreements.
oh gosh, I couldn't agree more. So recent experience has taught me so within the process that we use. So to approve a new supplier, we need to go out and do an audit first. First of all, I think it really just establishes that nice sort of working relationship with them. You get to know them, you get a feel for how their quality management system works. There are sections, 13485 is and always will be interpreted slightly differently. So what one organization feels is acceptable may not be acceptable for another organization. Now, this is your opportunity as the legal manufacturer to establish whether the controls within your CMO, your contract and manufacturing organization, are in fact going to be good enough, for you. So, for example, I mean, let's just go back to the example that we were just using. So, verification of purchase product. Some, manufacturers might just be quite happy with a little tick to say, "Yeah, no, we've inspected it and it's all, as per specifications." Fine. 1345 doesn't say that you need to be writing down everything, every single one. If that's how it works, then that's how it works. However, as a legal manufacturer, you might want additional assurances. You might actually want to be, measuring, those parts to be measured because you want to know if those parts, how consistent those parts will be. Just thinking about monitoring and measurement of your processes. So, I feel like it's always a good idea to kick off with an audit because then you can specify those additional controls within your steadfast quality agreements.
Yes, yes, that's a great option. And I mean, it's not necessarily something that everybody does or every organization does, but certainly for the critical
Yes.
suppliers, I think it's a great idea. Top tip from Amy.
Top tip. Oh, we're full of them. We had two today. Absolutely full of it. And then the last one before we get into documentation requirements is about the validation of application of computer systems used for your QMS. So we're talking about EQMS systems, and we do have another episode all about EQMS systems. Obviously, it's talking about the risk-based approach, with regards to its validation and revalidation. So I feel like we probably don't need to go into too much detail about 416. But what do you think, Susie?
Yeah, the other thing I would say, your EQMS is a great example, but it also extends to any kind of, and this, I think, Amy, you even referenced the GAMP
Oh, yes.
documentation and the guidance documents before, because this does extend to software that is used in an equipment, a piece of
Mhm.
equipment, like a liquid handler or something like that, where
Mhm.
you're talking about um, giving it instructions and a recipe to follow, or whatever the kind of piece of software it might be. It extends to, it can extend to even like a spreadsheet. If you're using a spreadsheet to perform calculations, or
Mhm.
maybe even return acceptance criteria for your quality control activities or whatever it might be, you might need to validate that. So
Mm.
I urge everybody to dig into this a little bit more and make sure that they understand the full scope of things that might need validation. Software validation could be your training application, a document control application, depending on whether you've purchased things off the shelf or if you've made it yourself, all of those kinds of things. It is more than just the QMS, but it doesn't have to be everything either. Again, proportionate to the risk is a key phrase.
Ah, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Yeah, the validation of Excel spreadsheets is something I've done a few times.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not the most entertaining of things, but again, if you're using it to demonstrate that the product is in conformance with the specifications,
Right.
oh my god, absolutely, you want to make sure that that's giving you the right data.
Right.
Absolutely.
All right.
So,
Oh, what's the next one?
well, you've got documentation requirements here. So, we
Yes.
are just talking about, so you've got your general requirements, quality manual, and control of documents, control of records. But what I really do find this interesting, and call me a quality nerd, I don't care. But the fact that you've got your medical device file in your documentation requirements and not specifically referenced in section 7, I think gives you an idea of what the standard is trying to tell you here. It's saying the purpose of your organization is pretty much just this medical device file, isn't it? It's setting the scene for what controls are going to be applicable to you. What risk-based approach, what's the risk-based approach that you're going to be applying? It's going to be because of this medical device file, because of those products that you are manufacturing. So I do find that the fact that the medical device file isn't section 4 and not later down in the standard very interesting, because it's setting the scene.
Yes, definitely. As I mean, consistent with the rest of the clause, we continue to set the scene and set our expectations, and it includes those high level documents, right? Of the
Mhm.
quality manual, quality policy, objectives, um, and the medical device file. And it's also the element that says you have to have procedures that,
Mhm.
documented procedures for these requirements.
Mhm.
I don't know, sometimes, especially in early stage organizations, people do activities maybe before they've written the SOP down, because they're just developing things sort of on
Mhm.
the fly. And it's like at some point you need to write it down. And this is why. This is the clause that tells you you have to have documented procedures. That everything you do has to have a procedure.
Yes, absolutely. And then obviously you got the records, because as you said before, if it wasn't written down, it didn't happen.
Right. Right. And like the medical device file too, going back to that, not only do those include, like, the medical device file, also remember includes procedures, right? Because you
Mhm.
talk about
Mhm.
your methods
Mhm.
for manufacture, or those methods that you're using, those procedures that you're following. It's all part
Mhm.
of the medical device file as well. And also it extends, remember that this extends to things like packaging, which I feel like is often
Mhm.
forgotten, right? We're generally pretty good about writing down specifications for labeling and specifications for manufacturing and storage and,
Mhm.
measuring and monitoring, but we can't forget that packaging is a part of that medical device file too. And changes to that packaging has to be controlled in the same way that changes to the device itself are controlled.
Yeah, absolutely. Change management. So, so, so important.
And
And
all this
then,
back to change management, isn't it?
Oh, all roads lead to change. All roads need to change. And then, of course, those keywords as appropriate for requirements for installation for servicing. Now, as appropriate does feature many times within the standard. Not it's just not solely in section 4. So when you read it, just make sure that I mean, you don't necessarily have to do everything. You have to define what's appropriate, and what is appropriate is determined by your medical device file. It is determined by what the role of your organization. So don't just assume because it's written down here you actually have to comply with it. If it's got those magical words as appropriate, just have a think about whether it is relevant to your organization.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I really love the flexibility that as
Mhm.
appropriate gives you.
Mhm.
Right. And this is where I think as quality professionals, sometimes we struggle because there are some folks among us who, have been burned in the past, right? And so apply a really conservative approach in all things. And then there are some of us who are, more liberal in all things. And then there's a happy medium. The key is it's as appropriate, it's proportionate to the risk, it's as applicable. Like, these are the phrases that allow you to select the controls or the level of rigor that is appropriate for the activity or for the task or for the item or for the device itself. So that's the that's the freedom. Those
Mhm.
phrases are the freedom that you have.
I think that covers everything for section 4. So I really hope you found that interesting and don't underrate the relevance of section 4. But guys, do remember.
Don't panic. Read the SOP.
Catch you next time.
Bye.